Samuel Vidal arrived just after sunset, towing behind him a rusted but dignified fishing boat that seemed to have lived more lives than any vessel had a right to. He chose Lot 14 at the end of Waverly Marina, the most secluded spot in the gated community of Crestmont Shore. With a quiet nod to the security guard at the entrance, he parked the truck, stepped out, and gazed at the still waters. No one knew that this new neighbor had once held the lives of foreign agents and national secrets in his calloused hands. The residents of Crestmont Shore noticed him immediately, not because he caused a scene, but because he didn't. No welcome party, no glass of wine at the clubhouse. Just a silent man, unpacking boxes, moving furniture, and mooring a boat that clearly didn't meet the HOA's aesthetic standards. Karen Dalmeda, self-appointed guardian of neighborhood perfection and president of the HOA, watched him from her bay window with suspicion. Something about him felt uncontrolled. What they didn't know was that Samuel had chosen Crestmont Shore deliberately. Years ago, during the closing days of a covert mission, he'd intercepted documents that implicated local officials and unnamed community leaders in a hidden political scandal. Those documents were now beneath the deck of his boat, hidden in a sealed compartment, protected by custom-engineered locks and lined with fireproof casing. Samuel wasn't just looking for peace. He was watching, waiting, and someone was about to wake a sleeping lion. Karen Dalmeda ruled Crestmont Shore like it was her personal kingdom, not merely a suburban neighborhood. With crisp blazers, manicured nails, and a clipboard that never left her side, she conducted daily inspections under the guise of preserving property values. Her newsletter, Crestmont Clarity, served as both community update and veiled threat. It wasn't uncommon for residents to find a fine or warning on their doorstep for grass an inch too long or a mailbox not painted in approved neutral tones. To Karen, the neighborhood wasn't just a place to live, it was a reflection of her own control. She'd risen from nothing, marrying well, divorcing better, and climbing the social ladder until she stood atop it, lonely but untouchable. The arrival of Samuel, and more specifically his unsightly boat, struck her like a personal insult. The rust on the bow, the outdated paint, and worst of all, the fact that he hadn't attended the HOA welcome brunch. Karen didn't care who he was, she was determined to bring him under her thumb. She began her campaign in subtle ways, a note taped to his door, a sideways glance at the marina, an anonymous complaint filed under a false name. But Samuel didn't react. He didn't fight back, didn't remove the boat, didn't respond to her notices. That silence infuriated her more than any confrontation would have. And in that growing silence, her obsession was born, not just with the boat, but with the man who dared ignore her reign. It became the subject of whispers and side glances, that boat. To the untrained eye, it was simply an aging vessel, chipped paint, barnacle stains, and a nameplate so faded it was unreadable. But to the residents of Crestmont Shore, especially those who bowed to Karen's rule, it was an eyesore, a defiance of their curated world. The marina had long been a symbol of pristine elegance, with sailboats polished like mirrors and yachts gleaming in the sun. Samuel's boat was a blemish in paradise. At HOA meetings, Karen manipulated the conversation masterfully, planting seeds of complaint among her more loyal followers. "It's bringing down property values," she'd say. "We have rules for a reason." Some residents mumbled agreement not because they truly cared, but because disagreeing with Karen was social suicide. One couple dared to suggest that maybe the boat didn't matter, their front garden was mysteriously cited for 5 violations the following week. But through all the passive-aggressive remarks and the tightening noose of community pressure, Samuel remained unmoved. He spent quiet evenings on the boat, sanding its deck, sipping black coffee, watching the horizon. He fixed the railing with surgeon-like precision, replaced bolts and panels without a word. But he never let anyone inside. That only made them more curious, and in Karen's case, dangerously so. Beneath the creaking wooden planks of Samuel's boat, hidden beneath a false panel only accessible with a triple-sequence mechanical lock, lay a steel case no larger than a carry-on suitcase. Inside it were folders stamped with government insignias, a waterproof flash drive, photographs that had never seen daylight, and a worn journal filled with coded annotations. The case had been with Samuel since the final year of his service, when a deep-cover mission went sideways and key evidence was buried to protect powerful names. The compartment had been carefully insulated against fire, water, and even electromagnetic surveillance. Samuel had taken every precaution. Not because he feared being discovered, but because he knew someone, someday, would come looking for what he had. He wasn't hiding from danger. He was baiting it, waiting for the right moment to draw it out. And Crestmont Shore, with its polished gates and false tranquility, was the perfect trap. That morning, as he sat cross-legged inside the boat with the hatch open, he reread the files. A name stood out. Not because it surprised him, but because it confirmed a quiet suspicion. Karen Dalmaida had once been known by another name years ago, tied to an offshore account flagged during a federal probe. The case had been buried when the witness vanished until now. Samuel closed the case slowly, like sealing a tomb, unaware that just 2 docks down, Karen was watching through binoculars. By the end of the week, the marina had become a stage for murmurs and sideways glances. It started with simple questions. Did you see the man on the boat again? Why doesn't he talk to anyone? But as Karen subtly fanned the flames, the conversations grew darker. Rumors began to take shape. Samuel was a fugitive, a smuggler, a former soldier with PTSD who snapped. The stories had no proof, but in Crestmont Shore, appearances were often more dangerous than facts. A few of the more curious neighbors took it upon themselves to investigate, wandering closer to the boat under the pretense of casual walks. One man even pretended to lose his dog nearby. Samuel, ever watchful, said nothing. He simply stood on the deck, calm and unreadable, and their courage always crumbled under his silent stare. But Karen didn't flinch. To her, his silence was an invitation, a puzzle that had to be solved, had to be controlled. What no one knew was that Samuel had installed a second layer of security weeks prior, small, discreet surveillance devices placed not just on his boat, but along the dock, at the marina's entrance, even within the HOA's mailbox kiosk. Every whisper, every suspicious look, every conversation was being recorded. He wasn't just living in the neighborhood. He was building a profile, and soon, everyone would be exactly where he needed them to be. It came in an envelope marked with the HOA crest, gold embossed, overly formal, and smelling faintly of lavender and ink. Samuel opened it without expression, reading each line with the precision of a man who had once scanned dossiers for hidden threats. Violation, unauthorized maritime equipment of non-compliant aesthetic standards. It was signed in confident cursive, Karen Dalmaida, HOA president. The letter demanded removal of the boat within 10 business days or fines would begin accruing. Samuel read it twice, then neatly folded it and slid it into a folder alongside other HOA notices. He made no call. He filed no complaint. He simply walked back to his boat, unlocked the cabin, and reviewed footage from the night before. Karen had approached the vessel under the cover of darkness, standing less than 5 feet from the hull, clipboard in hand. She hadn't touched anything yet, but the intent was unmistakable. She wasn't going away. Later that evening, while the neighborhood lights blinked on like fireflies in synchronized obedience, Samuel typed a short message into an encrypted device. The message didn't go to a friend or neighbor, it went to a secure server tied to a dormant FBI archive. 4 words, she's making her move. Then he locked the boat, poured himself a bourbon, and waited. Karen had just taken the first step into a game she didn't know she was playing. The pier had always been a place of quiet walks and polite nods, where retirees fished in silence and children dipped their toes into the glassy water. But after the warning letter, it changed. Karen's gaze lingered longer during her inspection strolls, and new faces began appearing on the dock, residents who'd never shown interest in the marina before, now conveniently crossing paths with Samuel at odd hours. The pier had become a surveillance zone, and everyone was pretending not to look. Samuel saw everything. The man who parked twice in front of Lot 14 without ever stepping out. The jogger who looped the marina 3 times in 1 hour, always slowing near the boat. Even the HOA landscaper, suddenly assigned to trim bushes right at the edge of Samuel's dock. He watched it all through his hidden lenses, storing timestamps, behaviors, patterns. It was sloppy surveillance, driven by curiosity rather than training. But it was surveillance nonetheless. And still, Samuel said nothing. That silence unnerved Karen more than any confrontation could have. She was used to pushing people into reacting, into showing their weakness. But Samuel's stillness felt like a mirror, one that showed her own paranoia growing. She couldn't understand why he wouldn't defend himself. What she didn't know was that he wasn't defending. He was documenting. Every step closer she took to his world was another thread in a web she didn't know he was spinning. Karen's initial annoyance had transformed into something far darker, a fixation. What began as a battle over community standards morphed into a personal crusade. She started waking earlier, slipping out before sunrise to inspect the marina in her robe and slippers, scribbling notes into a little red journal she kept hidden behind HOA documents. She was convinced that Samuel was hiding something, and the not knowing consumed her. She began tracking his schedule, noting the times he left, when he returned, and how long he stayed on the boat. She even installed a motion sensor light on her balcony for safety, though its real purpose was to spotlight his every movement at night. Her obsession was no longer about the boat's aesthetics, it was about power. Samuel had something she couldn't name, couldn't control, and that threatened the fragile empire she'd built over the years. The neighborhood began to notice the shift. Karen, once the composed figurehead of order, now looked tired, more agitated. At meetings, her voice was sharper, her rules more aggressive. Residents whispered behind her back about the boat guy driving her mad. But Karen didn't care. She was certain she was on the brink of uncovering something huge, and she'd be damned if some quiet, brooding loner unraveled her kingdom without a fight. It happened just after 2 a.m. when the neighborhood was at its deepest sleep and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the dock and the faint buzz of a distant transformer. Karen crept across the marina barefoot, her heels tucked in one hand, her other gripping a small crowbar wrapped in cloth. She wore black, not for stealth, but because it felt theatrical, like she was stepping into a role. She told herself it was justified. If Samuel wouldn't follow the rules, she'd force him to. She reached the boat and hesitated. The moon reflected off the worn paint, and for a moment she saw her own face in the water, distorted and unfamiliar. But the moment passed. She climbed aboard, careful not to make the planks creak. Her heart pounded as she reached the cabin door, surprisingly unlocked. Inside, the scent of oil and salt filled her nostrils. She moved quickly, prying up floorboards near the center of the cabin, hoping to damage enough to make removal inevitable, perhaps even condemnation. But then her crowbar struck something metallic. Not wiring. Not support beams. A box. She wedged it open, and the lid popped with a soft hiss of pressure. Inside, the glow of plastic sleeves, stamped folders, photographs. Faces. Names. Government emblems. A flash drive marked with an FBI insignia. Karen froze. Her hands began to tremble. She realized she hadn't just trespassed or vandalized. She had stumbled into something far larger, far more dangerous, and Samuel had recorded every second of it. Karen stumbled backward, breath caught in her throat, the crowbar slipping from her grasp and clattering softly on the wood. Panic surged through her veins like electricity. She reached down to grab the documents, to stuff them back inside the box, maybe to erase what she had seen, but her fingers shook uncontrollably. One folder fell open. The photo staring back at her was from 2 decades ago, a younger version of herself sitting across from a man whose face had been redacted. The page was labeled, Asset K Delta, Witness Protection Application, Denied. She barely had time to process it before the camera above the hatch gave a soft mechanical click. She looked up, mouth agape. It wasn't just a hidden camera, it was active. The red light blinked once, then disappeared. Karen felt the blood drain from her face. Whatever game she thought she was playing, she now understood she'd been walking into someone else's. She wasn't the hunter anymore. She was bait caught on camera inside a federal agent's vessel tampering with protected evidence. She fled the boat in silence, trying to compose herself, wiping her fingerprints off every surface as if that could undo what she'd done. But the damage wasn't just physical, it was systemic. The very life she'd built, the identity she'd crafted, the story she'd told the world, all of it was splintering like the broken deck beneath her heels. And she knew as she slipped back into her home and locked the door behind her that Samuel wasn't going to the HOA. He was going somewhere higher. At dawn, while the marina still lay in shadows and the rest of Crestmont Shore clung to its illusion of normalcy, Samuel sat alone inside the cabin of his boat, the steel case open before him. He had reviewed the footage 3 times already. Every movement Karen made, every expression of panic, every glance at the documents, all captured with pristine clarity. But it wasn't the footage that mattered most. It was what she had touched. The flash drive. He carefully retrieved it with gloved hands and slid it into a secure laptop shielded from wireless intrusion. The data loaded slowly. It wasn't just an archive of case files, it was a map of suppressed investigations, bank transactions, offshore holdings, falsified birth records, and testimonies never entered into evidence. Among the many names listed, one pulsed on the screen like a heartbeat, K. Delgado, the name Karen had used before marrying into money and reinvention. She wasn't a stranger to federal attention. She was a ghost from an old file that had once gone cold. Samuel leaned back in his chair, hands folded, watching the screen. His instincts were sharp, honed by decades of fieldwork, and they told him one thing with absolute certainty: Karen hadn't just trespassed out of curiosity. She had been looking for something she believed was hidden there, something she feared might surface. Now that fear was real. He backed up the data to a second drive, placed it in a waterproof pouch, and sealed it beneath the new floor panel. The game had changed, and he was no longer playing defense. The next day, Samuel drove into the nearby city under the pretense of a supply run. In truth, he visited a former contact, an off-the-books analyst named Marla Chin, who now worked as a cybersecurity consultant for private contractors. She owed Samuel more than a few favors from their shared history in covert operations. When he handed her a duplicate of the flash drive and said, "Find everything you can on K. Delgado," her eyes narrowed. She didn't ask questions. She knew better. While Marla began the data reconstruction, Samuel sat in her office surrounded by faded photographs on the walls, old teams, dead agents, missions long buried under red tape. He stared at one image in particular, a blurry group shot from the early 2000s. One face stood out, half-shadowed and smiling, a woman with sharp features and eyes that now looked unmistakably like Karen's. He remembered then how that mission had ended, compromised by an insider. The official report named no names. But now he had one. Back in Crestmont Shore, Karen was unraveling. She had barely slept, her hands trembled over coffee mugs, and she snapped at neighbors with uncharacteristic rage. Her instincts told her something was coming, but she didn't know how or when. She began digging into Samuel's past with what limited resources she had, calling in favors, whispering to the few remaining allies she hadn't alienated. What she didn't realize was that Samuel was already 3 moves ahead, and the face she tried to bury years ago had just stepped back into the light. The HOA office, usually a symbol of Karen's order and control, had become a scene of disarray. Papers were scattered across the desk, files half open, and Karen sat in front of her laptop, pale and sweat-beaded, clicking through online background checks and encrypted public record sites. She had called an emergency board meeting under the guise of discussing security breaches, but really she was looking for a way to cover her tracks or destroy them if necessary. 2 of her committee members arrived early and found her pacing, muttering to herself, visibly disturbed. When one asked what the emergency was, she snapped, "There's something dangerous happening. That man, he's not who he says he is." But when pressed for details, she floundered. She couldn't admit to breaking into his boat. She couldn't reveal what she saw. All she could do was insist on increasing security around the marina and pushing through a motion for immediate vessel removal, a move so aggressive it raised eyebrows even among her loyalists. In that moment, the foundation of Karen's power began to crack. The HOA board, once her echo chamber, started asking quiet questions. Why was she so obsessed with Samuel? Why had she been so evasive about past identity verifications when she became president? And why now was she suddenly afraid? Samuel, meanwhile, watched all of this unfold through his private surveillance feed, the live video of the meeting quietly uploading to a secure server. Karen wasn't just panicking, she was cornering herself. And she didn't even realize the walls were made of glass. Karen had always believed that lies, if carefully woven, could hold up like silk, strong enough to carry weight, light enough to escape notice. Over the years, she had crafted an identity with surgical precision, the elegant community leader, the respectable ex-wife of a wealthy developer, the woman who built Crestmont Shore into a model of order. But now, under pressure, that web was fraying fast, and those she once charmed began to see the inconsistencies. Digging into her past, Samuel uncovered a sequence of name changes, overseas residencies, and shell companies tied to her former alias, K. Delgado. Each led back to a cold case involving embezzlement from a South American charity foundation connected to a U.S. senator's campaign. The scandal was buried after the witness vanished. That witness had a scar above her left eyebrow, a scar Karen now concealed beneath artful bangs and foundation. But no disguise could hide from Samuel's trained eye or the facial recognition algorithm Marla had running. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. She began spreading rumors that Samuel was a former convict, that he had ties to organized crime, that he was secretly living under an alias himself. But the problem with spinning lies in a community full of cameras, emails, and digital footprints is that one truth, when revealed, tears down 20 lies in an instant. And Samuel wasn't just gathering evidence, he was preparing to release it. Her web, once invisible, was now gleaming under floodlights, and each thread led right back to her. Samuel's living room had been transformed into a silent war room. On the walls were pinned timelines, surveillance photos, and declassified documents. His laptop ran constant data syncs with off-site encrypted servers. For years, he had kept everything close to the chest, evidence from old missions, raw intelligence reports, unofficial witness statements, things the Bureau didn't want in the light, but that Samuel knew might one day matter again. That day had come. He wasn't just building a case against Karen, he was threading her into a much larger story, one that included campaign finance fraud, whistleblower suppression, and the disappearance of a federal witness in Ecuador nearly 20 years earlier. Her fingerprints were all over it, metaphorically and, as the FBI forensics lab would soon confirm, literally. The crowbar she used to damage his boat? Still in her garage. Unwiped. Untouched. A rookie mistake made by someone who thought they were still invisible. Marla's latest intel came through with one chilling confirmation. A dormant federal file codenamed Liar's Echo had just been reactivated. Samuel had triggered it by submitting a partial dossier with Karen's past aliases and the footage of her breaking onto the boat. The Bureau hadn't responded yet, but it wouldn't be long now. Samuel didn't need to chase Karen anymore. He had set the gears in motion. All he had to do was wait for the system she once escaped to finally close in. The name hadn't been spoken aloud in nearly 2 decades. Operation Sentinel, an intelligence sweep designed to dismantle a transnational corruption ring that spanned 3 continents and infiltrated government, charity networks, and private development firms. It had been Samuel's last major field operation before his retirement. Officially, it had ended in failure. Unofficially, it had been sabotaged from the inside. Files went missing. Witnesses disappeared. Trails went cold. And one of those witnesses listed under codename K, Delgado, had simply vanished until now. When Samuel reviewed his original mission logs, he noticed details that hadn't made sense back then now aligned perfectly. The offshore accounts Karen used to fund her HOA political rise were once tied to laundering arms money through a South American NGO. Her ex-husband, now dead from a freak boating accident, had been under quiet federal observation for his connection to those same channels. Operation Sentinel had never really ended. It had simply gone dormant, waiting for someone, somewhere, to light the match again. And Samuel had struck that match. The encrypted report he sent to DC was no longer just a personal archive, it was a call to reactivate a buried investigation. He had made the first move and he knew what would follow: surveillance, sealed indictments, field agents asking old questions with new urgency. Karen wasn't facing a neighbor with a grudge anymore. She was facing the unfinished business of a global operation, and Samuel, the ghost of her past, had returned not just for justice but to finish what had been stolen from history. For years, Samuel had watched the world from a distance, a silent observer trained to see what others ignored. But now, for the first time since Operation Sentinel fell apart, he stepped back into his old skin. He wasn't just the quiet man with a boat anymore. He was the Watcher, the field name given to him by his colleagues for his ability to see patterns before they formed, to connect the invisible lines others missed. Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was a thread pulled from the same tangled web he'd nearly died untangling. In public, Samuel remained the model of restraint. He attended the HOA's community cookout with a calm smile, bringing a store-bought potato salad and making small talk with neighbors he had thoroughly profiled. He shook hands with people whose emails he had already decrypted. Every glance, every comment, every twitch of Karen's eye as she spotted him moving easily among the crowd, it was all part of the stagecraft. She looked rattled, out of place, the queen of a crumbling court surrounded by loyal subjects now full of doubt. Behind the scenes, the signals started. A black SUV parked just outside Crestmont Shore for 27 minutes, engine idling. A drone passed once over the marina and disappeared. Samuel received a silent text from a former handler: "Your flag has been raised." That meant eyes were on him, not hostile but alert. It meant the Bureau was listening. It meant Sentinel had been seen. And now the ghosts were waking up. Karen called the emergency meeting with barely 24 hours notice, framing it as a matter of community safety and compliance. The clubhouse was packed, retirees in polos, young professionals with toddlers on their laps, wine moms clutching their reusable bottles. But the energy in the room had shifted. The usual blind loyalty was gone. Whispers traveled faster than her prepared speech. People had heard things about the vandalized boat, about strange cars near the gates, about Karen's late-night visits to the marina. She stood at the podium trying to project confidence, but her voice betrayed her, tight, breathless, just slightly off-key. "We have a resident who has repeatedly ignored HOA standards. His presence and the vessel he maintains present a risk to the harmony of our community." Her eyes flicked toward Samuel, seated in the back row, arms calmly crossed, his gaze unblinking. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Everyone could feel the tension, something was wrong, and it wasn't the boat. Then came the questions. A board member asked for documentation on Karen's past. Another brought up an anonymous tip about property records filed under 2 different names. Samuel simply sat and watched the unraveling. He had planted no evidence, spoken no accusations. But the weight of the truth, the kind that leaks from silence, was enough. Karen realized then that her control was slipping, not because of an attack, but because the room had started thinking for itself. 3 days after the emergency meeting, a package arrived anonymously at the Crestmont Shore HOA office. No return address. No name. Just a flash drive in a padded envelope labeled, Property Dispute, Marina Evidence. The assistant secretary, curious and unaware of the storm it contained, plugged it into the meeting room projector before the next scheduled board session. What followed silenced the room. The footage played without commentary. It began with Karen sneaking barefoot across the pier, the crowbar in hand. It showed her boarding Samuel's boat, breaking the floor panel, uncovering the steel case, and rummaging through the contents. Her expression shifted from arrogance to horror as she stared down at the files. The video had been edited only to zoom, enhance key facial angles, and highlight timestamps. It ended on a free frame of her looking directly at the hidden camera, her face ghost white under the infrared lens. By the time Karen arrived, the room had turned against her. She stepped into silence, eyes flickering from screen to neighbors to the gavel in the board president's hand. For the first time in her reign, she was not the one in control. She didn't speak. She couldn't. One woman muttered, "Is that really her?" Another said flatly, "We've been lied to." The projector went dark. The evidence wasn't just seen, it was believed. And with that belief, the fall of Karen D'Almeida truly began. Crestmont Shore was no longer the pristine haven it had once pretended to be. After the footage leaked, the air thickened with unease. Neighbors no longer waved. Conversations became clipped, cautious. Everyone questioned what else had been hidden, not just by Karen, but by each other. Behind white fences and manicured hedges, doubt had settled in like fog. The perfect facade had cracked, and no amount of HOA protocol could seal it shut again. Some residents rallied behind Samuel, quietly slipping thank you notes into his mailbox, nodding at him with newfound respect. Others kept their distance, afraid of what else he might know or what else he might reveal. One couple moved out entirely, their for sale sign appearing overnight without notice. Rumors swirled about Karen's past, about federal agents, about whether Crestmont Shore had ever truly been what it claimed. The community had lived in curated comfort, now it lived in suspicion. Karen, once omnipresent, had all but vanished from public view. Her house lights stayed off. Her windows, once wide open to show off designer interiors, were sealed behind blackout curtains. And yet, her presence lingered like smoke. Everyone felt her watching. Or perhaps they only feared that Samuel was still watching, that the cameras were still on, the recordings still happening. They were right. Samuel hadn't shut anything off. He was still observing, not out of vengeance, but out of habit. The operation wasn't over yet. The black SUV returned, but this time it didn't idle. It parked. The door opened and a woman in a charcoal suit stepped out, sunglasses hiding her eyes, her gait smooth and purposeful. Her badge was real, though she didn't flash it right away. She didn't need to. Samuel saw her from the dock before she knocked. Agent Lena Marquez, Bureau Intelligence Division, one of the few remaining operatives who remembered Operation Sentinel not as a failure, but as a deliberately buried success. She didn't smile. They exchanged a firm handshake, the kind that carried more history than words. Inside the boat, over closed blinds and a pot of bitter black coffee, Lena plugged in her encrypted drive and uploaded Samuel's entire archive into the federal case system. "You've triggered 6 dormant flags," she said flatly. "DC wants containment, not headlines. But they're listening now." Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it wasn't friendly either. Samuel had forced their hand and she was the hand. They spoke for hours. She reviewed the footage, the files, the timeline. When she saw Karen's name, her real name, on the old witness list, she let out a long, quiet exhale. "We thought she was dead," she murmured. Samuel said nothing. He had let the system sleep long enough. Before Agent Marquez left, she handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter of full immunity retroactively applied to his possession of classified materials. Beneath it, a handwritten note, "You did what we wouldn't." Long before she was Karen D'Almeida, queen of HOA regulations and porcelain smiles, she was Karina Delgado, a gifted linguist and political liaison who moved easily between American NGOs and South American ministers. Her charm disarmed embassies, her signature unlocked 6-figure transfers. Officially, she was there to coordinate relief efforts. Unofficially, she was the go-between for a network of illicit campaign donations funneled through shell charities into American political coffers. She was fluent in 5 languages and in lies. Karina vanished after the collapse of a Bolivian aid front suspected of laundering cartel money under diplomatic protection. When federal investigators closed in, she cooperated briefly. Her testimony helped implicate a junior senator but failed to secure full prosecution. She was placed in witness protection under the Sentinel Initiative, but within months she vanished again, taking with her the names, the routes, and the passwords no one else could decode. The Bureau presumed her dead. But Karina didn't die. She simply reinvented herself in the safest place no one would think to look, a quiet American suburb. She built Crestmont Shore like she built her old alliances, transactional, controlled, built on fear masked as order. She made herself indispensable. But no one escapes the past forever. The name Karen Dalmaida was now officially linked in a reopened federal file, and the media, fed a leak from within, was beginning to dig. The HOA queen wasn't just a local tyrant anymore. She was a fugitive masquerading as a patriot, and the world was finally about to see the full picture. Samuel had ensured that her erasure had an expiration date, and it had just been reached. Samuel had never truly retired. While he had stepped out of the spotlight, he had quietly kept the embers of his old network burning. Some of his former contacts were still in the field, operatives who owed him favors, analysts who remembered the missions that didn't make it into the official archives. Others had become whistleblowers, journalists, cyber forensics experts. They didn't meet in offices. They didn't use phones. They communicated through encrypted channels, dead drops, and codes hidden in news article metadata. When he reached out to them about Karina, they responded quickly. Not out of duty, but out of recognition. Everyone remembered her, even if they didn't know they did. She had been a ghost in multiple files, the unnamed source in 3 separate international investigations, the vanished link in every scandal that had quietly died in committee. With Samuel's footage and data, the puzzle pieces began falling into place across 4 countries. His quiet war room had become a nerve center for justice long delayed. Meanwhile, inside Crestmont Shore, Samuel appeared to be living his same quiet life. Morning coffee on the deck. Afternoon maintenance on the boat. Calm, invisible. But in reality, every email, every news story, every shift in the community's behavior was being logged. And from behind the scenes, Samuel guided the final stage of the operation, not by force, not with a badge, but with information. His silence wasn't just strategic. It was surgical. Because sometimes the most powerful moves in an intelligence operation are the ones made without speaking a word. In a federal records facility buried beneath Arlington, Virginia, a case folder labeled Sentinel Declassified Review Pending was quietly reactivated. It hadn't been touched in 17 years. Now, lines that had once been redacted were revealed. Fingerprints long thought lost were matched. Old testimonies flagged as inconclusive were reopened for review. And at the heart of the surge in activity was one re-emerged name, Karina Delgado, aka Karen Dalmaida. She was no longer a ghost file, she was a lead. Journalists picked up the scent next. A freelance investigative reporter known for exposing covert financial networks published a story titled The Queen of HOA and the Cartel Money That Built Her Throne. The article, laden with circumstantial connections, didn't name her directly, but it didn't have to. The implications were clear. News vans began parking near the gates of Crestmont Shore. Reporters whispered questions to gardeners, dog walkers, delivery drivers. Cameras were trained not on celebrities, but on a woman who had once bought silence with power. Inside her house, Karen watched it all unfold. Her phone was filled with missed calls, mostly from old contacts, some pleading, others warning. She sat in darkness, phone on silent, staring at the original Sentinel photograph that had now gone viral, a woman in a crowded embassy, just off-center, face turned but unmistakably her. She had buried the truth under layers of identities, but the earth was shifting and the past was crawling up through the cracks. Samuel had done more than reopen a case. He had awakened a system that never forgets. It was a cruel irony that Karen, who had spent years weaponizing bylaws and regulations, now found herself cornered by the very rules she once enforced with an iron grip. The HOA's charter, crafted under her leadership, contained clauses about the immediate suspension of any board member under criminal investigation. After the footage leaked and federal inquiry letters arrived at the HOA office, her suspension was automatic. No vote, no ceremony. Just a formal letter posted on her door, "You are hereby relieved of duties pending federal review." Karen tried to fight it at first, writing rebuttals, citing legal loopholes, attempting to manipulate the system she had designed. But every appeal she made referred back to policies she had created herself. Her own words were used to silence her. She had always believed that power came from control, from knowing every rule, every weak point. But in building her perfect world, she had built a cage with no exits. The same signatures she once demanded from others now spelled out her exile. Samuel watched from his boat as Karen stood on her porch reading the letter, her hands trembling. Neighbors peeked through blinds, unsure whether to pity her or feel relieved. She was no longer feared. She was no longer respected. She was isolated, caught in a system of her own making, a queen dethroned by the order she had once ruled. And in that moment, Samuel knew he didn't need to bring her down. She had already done it to herself. In the sea of documents Samuel had stored, photographs, bank ledgers, intelligence memos, there was one file that stood above the rest. It was a plain PDF, no more than 6 pages long. But inside it was a signed statement from a missing federal witness dated 16 years ago, naming Karina Delgado as the architect of a covert financial pipeline that funneled foreign money into U.S. politics. The witness had disappeared before testifying, presumed dead. But the file remained buried and untouched. Until now. Samuel had preserved it not because he knew its full power, but because something in his gut told him it mattered. That intuition, the quiet instinct that had kept him alive in the field, had been right. The Bureau's Digital Forensics Division verified the signature, authenticated the metadata, and matched it to a handwriting sample in an unrelated narcotics case. With a single confirmation, the file went from circumstantial to federal gold, admissible, damning, and impossible to ignore. The moment the file was entered into the reopened Sentinel case, it triggered a cascade: subpoenas, sealed warrants, renewed surveillance on Karen's financial activity, and quiet interviews with former HOA members. The media hadn't seen it yet, but they would. And when they did, it wouldn't just be about a woman who ran a neighborhood like a kingdom. It would be about how one forgotten file, hidden beneath the deck of a boat in a quiet marina, shook the pillars of 2 nations' secrets. It was just before dusk when the unmarked vehicle returned to Crestmont Shore. This time, it didn't stop at the gate. The guards had been informed in advance. Karen was home, seated in her living room with the blinds closed, the television off, and a glass of untouched wine in her hand. She didn't react when the knock came, 3 sharp taps followed by silence. Then the door opened and Agent Lena Marquez stepped in, not with handcuffs but with a recorder and a small leather notebook. "Ms. Delgado," she said, using the name deliberately. Karen flinched. The 2 women sat across from each other in the fading orange light. The questions were clinical, methodical. Lena wasn't looking for confessions, she was looking for consistency, watching for cracks, comparing every answer to files that had been hidden for years. "Where were you the night of the cologne transfer? Who authorized the Shell account in Buenos Aires? Do you recognize this man?" Each question was a scalpel. Each answer a wound. Karen tried to maintain composure, but her voice betrayed her. She stumbled, corrected herself, hesitated before dates she once knew by heart. Samuel watched from his boat as the last rays of sun touched the marina. Through his binoculars, he could just make out Lena's silhouette by the window, calm and unmoving. He knew the posture well, it was the stance of someone getting what they came for. The interrogation wouldn't lead to a dramatic arrest. No. It would be the beginning of a methodical dismantling. And the sun would set on Karen not with a bang, but with quiet, undeniable exposure. It happened in the dead of night. A sudden bloom of orange and red lit up the marina like a flare from the underworld. Samuel's boat, his sanctuary, his archive, his trap, was engulfed in flames. The fire moved fast, too fast for an accident. Alarms screamed through the stillness and residents emerged in panic, clutching robes and phones, watching helplessly as the blaze devoured everything in its path. By the time emergency crews arrived, the boat was little more than smoldering ash and warped metal. But Samuel wasn't on board. He stood at the edge of the dock, arms crossed, jaw set, watching with the quiet resolve of a man who had expected this. He hadn't slept on the boat in over a week, not since he'd backed up every file to 3 different off-site servers. He hadn't left anything to chance. The boat had served its purpose. It was bait, and the one who took it had revealed themselves. The fire was an act of desperation, not strategy, a final, futile effort to erase the truth. Investigators found traces of accelerant. Surveillance footage, not destroyed, but streamed live to cloud storage, showed a figure in a hoodie and gloves pouring gasoline through a broken window. Though the face was hidden, the gait, the body language, it was unmistakable to Samuel. Not Karen herself, but someone she'd called in, a last-ditch contact from the past. What they didn't know was that the fire didn't destroy the evidence. It activated the next phase. Because Samuel had planned for this. He always had. And the fire that consumed the marina had only fueled what came next. The arrest didn't happen in the dead of night or with sirens blaring. It happened quietly, deliberately, and with the precision of a federal machine that had waited far too long. Karen Delgado, once Karina Delgado, was escorted from her home in broad daylight. No cuffs. No yelling. Just 2 agents in dark suits and a signature on a warrant backed by years of evidence. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, stunned into silence. The woman who once ruled their lives with citations and threats was being removed by forces greater than any HOA. Her expression was unreadable, too tired for pride, too cornered for rage. She didn't speak as she was led to the black vehicle waiting at the curb. Her porch, once adorned with seasonal wreaths and symmetrical flower pots, now looked like the crumbling steps of a fallen regime. A child asked his mother, "Is she going to jail?" The mother didn't answer. She only held the boy's hand tighter and watched the queen disappear. In the days that followed, news broke across national channels. High-profile HOA president exposed as former fugitive in federal money laundering scheme. Politicians distanced themselves. Lawyers scrambled to review old real estate deals connected to her. The case against her grew not just from Samuel's files, but from people who had once feared her, now emboldened to speak. Her reign had ended not with a scandalous press conference, but with the slow erosion of her lies and the steady, relentless truth of one man who refused to forget. Crestmont Shore would never be the same. The manicured hedges still stood, the gates still buzzed open on command, and the marina was eventually repaired, but the illusion of perfection had shattered. Neighbors no longer whispered about lawn heights or mailbox colors. They spoke in hushed tones about federal agents, offshore accounts, and the quiet man who had lived among them with a truth too heavy for most to carry. The fear Karen once inspired had been replaced with introspection. People wondered what else they had chosen not to see. Samuel didn't stay long after her arrest. He packed his belongings with the same precision he'd brought to the neighborhood. No fanfare. No farewell speech. Just a final walk through the marina at sunrise, a brief pause at the dock where his boat once floated, and a nod to the security guard on his way out. He left behind a cleaner community, but not just in the cosmetic sense. He had peeled back the curtain and forced them to face what lay beneath their curated lives. And that in itself was a legacy far greater than justice. Some say he was never really a neighbor. Others say he was the best kind, one who paid attention when no one else would. His house was soon sold to a young couple who had no idea what had transpired behind those walls. But in the HOA records, one file remains permanently archived, untouchable by new leadership. It's labeled simply Case 0, Internal Cleansing. And above it, a handwritten note in bold black ink. Let no one rule through fear again.